Good day. Today is Wednesday, 17th September 2025. Today I'm traveling to the United States, to Chicago, to attend the Integrity Media event there. That means, obviously, that this is going to affect, as I discussed yesterday in my program, my ability to do programs and the length of those programs. And this particular program is a case in point because I am making it just before I leave London for my flight to the United States. And inevitably, this is therefore going to be a short program. It's also being made earlier in the day. So, of course, there may be many developments taking place over the course of the day, which I will not be able to cover in this program. But anyway, here's the program. Here's what I'm going to say today, with all of those caveats and qualifications that I've just given. Firstly, Donald Trump, the President of the United States, and his wife Melania are now in Britain. There's been ceremonies. They were all received at Heathrow Airport. This is a state visit. The President is going to meet the King. The Prime Minister, obviously, is going to have discussions and meetings with the President as well. I get the impression that in London at the moment, most of the political class is, however, mainly absorbed by the political crisis at the centre of government about the position of the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer. For example, there was an editorial in the Financial Times yesterday urging Labour MPs to stick with Starmer. It was a very strange editorial. It acknowledged that there is no reason to believe that Keir Starmer is going to improve in his government of Britain between now and whenever. There is no reason to think that he'll be able to get on top of the situation in any way. But nonetheless, and notwithstanding, Labour MPs are advised or called upon to help him. The exact words are, for the sake of his party and a country that craves a spell of serious government, the best outcome would be for Starmer and his reshuffled cabinet and number 10 operations to get their political act together. The Prime Minister has shown scant evidence he can do so. But Labour MPs should realise that their own best interests lie in helping him to turn his government around, not plotting against him. Well, there you have it. You have absolute conclusive evidence in the Financial Times that plots are going on. The Financial Times does not want Starmer removed. They don't want Starmer removed for one very simple reason, that they're worried that if Starmer is replaced by a new political leader, he's more likely to come from the left of the party and pursue policies that are contrary to those that the Financial Times endorses. Conceivably, a more left-wing Labour leader and Prime Minister might, for example, decide that the economic realities require a scaling down of support for Ukraine. Just saying. But note that despite all of that, they have to admit that there is scant evidence that Starmer can turn things around. So this is a call from the Financial Times to British MPs, Labour MPs, to stick by a failing Prime Minister. This is what Britain is facing now. And of course, we will have all the pomp and circumstance and ceremony of Donald Trump's visit. But the reality is that the entire political class is consumed at the moment with discussions about the Prime Minister's position. Now, I'm going to very quickly say that when this happens, when the political class is focused on the status of the Prime Minister, by far the likeliest outcome is that the Prime Minister goes. There have been occasions in the past when Prime Ministers who have faced political crisis and intense plotting have nonetheless managed to survive. Harold Wilson, a Prime Minister of immeasurably greater talents and political skills than Keir Starmer, was able to carry that off in the 1960s. And John Major, the British Conservative Prime Minister in the 90s, who bears an uncanny resemblance in some ways to Keir Starmer, was also successful in that regard in the 1990s. In the case of Major, I think that Conservative MPs today quietly recognise that sticking by Major merely ended up in preparing the ground for the Blair landslide of 1997, but I don't have the time to go into the history in this programme. Anyway, suffice to say, Prime Ministers have been known to get through these sort of periods of political turbulence. But to be blunt, I don't think Keir Starmer has that depth of support, either within the Labour Party or in the country, that Wilson certainly, and Major to some degree, unquestionably had. And frankly, I don't think that he has their level of political skill. Certainly he's not remotely as talented and as masterly in his ability to control the political situation and to surf the wave of British politics that Harold Wilson once was. And I don't think he's even up to the level of the far less capable and far less talented John Major. So I'm going to suggest that over the next few weeks and months, the plotting, the concerns, the debates within the Labour Party are going to intensify, and before long they will increasingly give the impression that the entire government is paralysed and is in crisis. And at that point, of course, Starmer's position will begin to become untenable, and then he will go. That, I think, is far and away the most likely outcome of what we're going to see. Anyway, Trump is coming into the midst of all of this, but he is obviously more concerned about wider issues. And yesterday, he finally had that telephone conversation with the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi that he has been agitating and seeking for weeks, apparently. Reports have appeared in the American media that on 4 occasions, President Trump has tried to talk to Modi since he started to impose tariffs on India, and that Modi has rejected his every call. This time, Modi took the call, and I suspect the reason for that is because Trump was phoning him to congratulate him on his 75th birthday. And Modi, who is a polite man, obviously felt that it would be ungracious to decline the call. And the call apparently went well, and Donald Trump seems very happy with it, and he's published this comment on Truth Social. Just had a wonderful phone call with my friend, Prime Minister Narendra Modi. I wished him a very happy birthday. He is doing a tremendous job. Narendra, thank you for your support on ending the war between Russia and Ukraine, President DJT. And subsequently, in the Truth Social, on Truth Social and his account on Truth Social, President Trump republished an article in the Hindu, an Indian newspaper, which also gave the Indian account of the call and also said that it was a friendly call and that the friendly relationship between these two leaders, Modi and Trump, appeared to have been restored. And it is absolutely correct that over the course of the call, Modi told Trump that India obviously does support all of Trump's efforts to bring the war to Ukraine to an end. Not a difficult thing for Modi to say, because if you follow official Russian commentary, and remember Russia and India are strategic partners, if you follow official Russian commentary, the Russians are saying the same thing. They also say that though they don't always agree with all of the various ideas that Donald Trump is proposing, nonetheless, they greatly appreciate Donald Trump's efforts to find a diplomatic solution to the conflict in Ukraine. They support them as far as they can, and they hope that eventually they will be successful. That is the official line that the Kremlin has been taking, and it was repeated only yesterday by Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov. And in this call between Modi and Trump, you can see the cleverness of that Russian position, because it enables Modi to take a call from Trump and to be polite and friendly to Trump and to tell Trump that yes, India does support his diplomatic effort, and India can do that and Modi can do that without appearing to be in any way disloyal to Russia and to Vladimir Putin. So this is diplomacy in action of a kind that unfortunately we no longer have the ability to do in the West. Now, notice the major omission, both from the Indian accounts of the conversation and from Trump's account of the conversation with Modi, because there is no hint in any of these readouts or comments that India is prepared to stop buying Russian oil. So, yes, the personal relationship between Trump and Modi has been repaired up to a point, but just as Putin has made no substantive concessions on the issue of Ukraine in all his various meetings with Trump, so Modi has not done so either in terms of India's fundamental economic interests. Anyway, let's move on. Now, there has been an article which has been published in Foreign Policy, one of the big three American magazines that cover foreign policy. They are Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, and the National Interest. Anyway, this article goes by the fascinating title that Zelensky is losing touch with reality. It is hard for anyone to make sense of the Ukrainian president's latest military reforms. And it is by Paul Hokenos, who we're told is a Berlin-based journalist. Now, the Foreign Policy has many articles, carries many articles. I would say that most of them continue to take what I would describe overall as a neocon position on most issues. But every so often you get an article like this, and to say it straightforwardly, I too believe that Zelensky is gradually losing touch with reality, though I ought to stress not just or even mostly in terms of military reforms. Now, he has carried out reforms. He has tried to reorganize the army in all kinds of ways. He's tried to superimpose a core structure on Ukraine's brigade structure. There's been much discussion about the chaotic organization of the Ukrainian army. There's been articles which say that the brigade structure that Ukraine has, in which basically brigades do what they want within a very loose structure of command. Anyway, it's been said that this creates and invites chaos. And of course, it ought to also be said that within the Ukrainian army, there are particular organizations or military groups, like, say, the Azov Corps, which to a great extent are a law unto themselves. So yes, I do think that there is a genuine degree of chaos, and no doubt the various reorganizations that Zelensky has been carrying out have increased that chaos. I am not sure myself that this has made all that much difference, actually, in terms of the war. It seems to me that Zelensky and Syrskyi nonetheless do manage to achieve a certain degree of command, a sufficient degree of command of the Ukrainian army in order to retain overall control of the military situation. And yes, if Ukraine were trying to conduct offensives, then this very loose and chaotic command structure over time would have problems. But given that Ukraine is overwhelmingly on the defensive, and with the exception of the disastrous Kursk operation of August last year, has been continuously on the defensive since the failure of its summer 2023 counteroffensive. I don't really see that these reorganizations and make all that difference. But that Zelensky is losing touch with reality, I think, is likely true. And I think that where he is actually losing touch is in his understanding of the military situation, the actual battlefield military situation. Zelensky has just sacked two military commanders who were responsible for defending Ukraine's positions in Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk regions and in the western Donbass region. This is the area where the Russians have been advancing remorselessly, pushing westwards towards the Dnieper River, getting ever closer to the river and to the city of Zaporozhye. That, to reiterate, there's still a significant distance on those 2 points. But they've also been closing, perhaps this is more pertinent, on the main supply road, the supply road to the city of Gulyapolye in the south, some of the supply roads that provide supplies to Orechov. And it's been a puzzle for many people, many commentators about the war, that the Russians have been able to keep advancing in this area and have been advancing remorselessly without the Ukrainians either being able to resist them effectively or apparently showing much interest, the military leadership in Kiev showing much interest in what is happening on this critical part of the front line. And of course there is a reason for this, and that is that by every account, Ukraine's army now is desperately overextended. It doesn't have enough men to be strong everywhere. Zelensky and Syrskyi have apparently concentrated most of their best brigades to try to contain the emerging crisis in Pakrovsk, about which I will say more shortly. That has left fewer men to hold the positions in Zaporozhye and Dnipro and western Donbass. And it's been unsurprising, therefore, that being so short of men and machines, the Ukrainians have been steadily pushed back. So there are objective reasons why Zelensky and Syrskyi have not responded to this accelerating collapse of the Ukrainian positions on the southern front lines until now. But I suspect that there is also a deeper reason, which is that, to say it straightforwardly, I think the local commanders have been giving Zelensky and Syrskyi a wildly over-optimistic assessment of the situation. I think they've been giving Zelensky and Syrskyi the impression that the situation was under control, when it obviously was not. And I think the penny has now dropped. There have been reports coming in, finally, that the Russians are outside the key villages, Poltavka, Veliko-Mikhailovka, Uspenovka, all of these places. I think this has sent a wave of alarm in Kiev, and the result is that Zelensky has sacked these commanders who have not been telling him the truth. And one can see that, we can see the results of that over the last few hours. Yesterday I mentioned that the Ukrainians have begun evacuations of people from some of these villages that are now being threatened, and that the situation finally is being taken seriously in Kiev. What, of course, they can do about it, given the shortages of men and machines right across the front lines, is an entirely different story. I am going to suggest that the same problem exists in relation to the situation around Pokrovsk. Zelensky and Syrskyi, after the Russian breakthrough in August in the area of northeast Pokrovsk, transferred many military units from around the battlefronts to contain the Russian breakthrough. There were endless reports from various Ukrainian military commanders, including in particular the 1st Azov Corps, that the counterattacks had been successful. It's been difficult to get an overall sense of what is happening in this area, because unlike the area in Zaporozhye, the Russian Defense Ministry has been extremely quiet about discussing operations in precisely this area, in the area of Pokrovsk and northeast of Pokrovsk. But over the last 48 hours, a trickle of information has come through. It looks as if Ukrainian gains as a result of the counterattacks have been relatively slight, as if the Russians have managed to maintain their positions, as if the Russians are continuing to hold positions in areas like Zaloty Kolodyaz and Kustechny Yar, and that they are continuing to advance in places like Belitskaya and Rodinska, and have maintained their positions close to the village of Grushinya further west. But importantly, it also looks as if there is an operational crisis developing further south within the boundaries of Pokrovsk itself, that the Russians are indeed pushing north from the village of Udachny towards the E50 road and are attacking the coal mine that lies to the south of it, and further east that the Russians are now gradually closing in on Mirnograd. And we've had people like Belinskaya and Bezuglaya, various commentators of that kind, and other Ukrainian commentators, suddenly discussing the realities of the situation in the Pokrovsk area, and saying that the information that the Ukrainian military leadership has been publishing about the situation in the Pakrovsk area is untrue, that there is actually a crisis in this area developing, and that one should basically not pay much attention to what the military leaders have been saying. If we're talking about Bezuglaya, who it must be stressed is a controversial figure in Ukraine, she has, by the way, admitted to having mental health issues, being, I believe, autistic. Anyway, when he's talking about Bezuglaya, it's important to stress that she's far from popular with everybody in Ukraine, including many people in the military. She is often criticized, and her particular pitch seems to be that Zelensky is listening too much to the generals, and the generals are not telling Zelensky the truth, and this obviously is making her unpopular with the generals, and is apparently also making Bezuglaya unpopular with some of the soldiers as well. Having said that, I suspect that this basically is the truth. I think that Zelensky, who apparently has a very short fuse, I remember reading some years back, about 2 years ago, that during an earlier military crisis, Zelensky spent his time screaming at his generals. This was published in the American media at that time. In other words, he doesn't like to hear bad news. In fact, I can remember when it was just a year and a half ago, at the time of the Russian advance into Kharkiv. Anyway, the point about Zelensky is that he doesn't like getting bad news. And since, of course, he has, at least in theory, power to sack generals, inevitably that is going to affect the ability and willingness of generals to give him bad news. And, of course, in Zelensky's case, at the moment, he has a particular incentive to continue to want to hear good news, because as we've discussed on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I, as Alex Christoforou has said on one of his programs, as I've said on one of my programs, it's become increasingly clear that the over-optimistic, over-rosy picture of the state of the war that President Trump is being given comes to Trump through General Kellogg and is being passed on to General Kellogg by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are telling Kellogg, who is very favorable to them, that all is well, the situation is under control, we are in fact winning the war, which emphatically is not true. Kellogg, in turn, is telling Trump this. Trump believes it, because why wouldn't he? And that probably explains, to a great extent, why Trump finds Putin's stance difficult to understand, because he cannot understand why Putin, whose army is supposedly experiencing all these catastrophic losses, who is losing the war, in effect, instead of winning it, won't freeze the war in the way that Trump wants, and which Kellogg has been telling Trump Putin would eventually do. So one could see the way in which information is being communicated, frontline commanders not telling Zelensky the full story. Zelensky, as the foreign policy says, having only a tenuous grip with reality. Zelensky and his officials passing on better news than the reality. To Kellogg passing on that good news to Trump, and of course the cycle then means that everybody is losing touch with the true reality on the front lines. Now, the fact that there is dissonance, that the Ukrainians are finding it increasingly difficult to get a handle on the real situation, is also illustrated by the problems that their major mapping project, their very good mapping project, I should stress, Deep State has been under. It ceased publication for several days in September. It's now come back, but it too is having problems, or so it seems to me, and does not seem to me to be up to date with the true situation in the Pokrovsk region. Anyway, that's the situation there. The Russians have been saying, there's reports about this in TASS, they've been increasingly optimistic, or so it seems to me, about the situation in Siversk. They say that the situation there is such that the Russian army now has a 12-kilometer wide front line close to Siversk itself, that they've been making significant advances towards Siversk. Deep State itself appears to acknowledge that the Russian military has entered the important village of Yampol, and anyway, the fighting there continues. Now, the other thing that has happened on the Ukrainian front lines over the last 24 hours is that for the first time in many months, the Russians have conducted a massive missile and drone strike across Ukraine, targeting Kiev, but other places also, including the eastern city of Kharkiv. And they've done this with drones, Geran drones, and missiles, and they've done this in broad daylight. Now, when the Russians do that, it seems to me that it's partly their way of demonstrating the collapse of Ukraine's air defense system, that Ukraine's air defense system is no longer functioning as it should, and that the missiles are able to strike targets across Ukraine and inflict immense damage on Ukraine. And from what I could see from the videos that I have looked at, the air defense system is simply non-functional now. These massive strikes that the Russians are conducting are now apparently focusing now increasingly on the railway system, which of course is used by Ukraine to transport men and supplies around the battlefronts, but they are also attacking warehouses and industrial facilities, and it is only a question of time, I think, before they will resume their attacks on Ukrainian energy facilities as well. To me, all of this looks like softening up Ukraine further in advance for a renewed offensive that the Russians perhaps are intending to launch after the fall of Pokrovsk. Just saying. Anyway, this is what I'm going to say about the situation on the military front lines. There's been less news, for example, from Kupiansk. I suspect that the situation there for the Ukrainians is also deteriorating. But this is what I wanted to say about the situation on the front lines. Now, in Europe, we continue to be living in our own world. Friedrich Merz has just made a big speech. I believe he made it to the Bundestag. He again spoke about Germany being at a crossroads. But the main threat that he identified again was the threat from Russia. He did talk about the problems of protectionism for the German economy, which of course, refers to the tariff policies of President Trump. But in all other respects, and mostly from what I could tell, the focus was on Russia, and it was also fairly clear to me that Merz was speaking increasingly of enemies at home. And, well, that probably is already a response to the AfD's breakthrough in the regional elections in the West German heartland state of North Rhine-Westphalia that I discussed a few days ago. So quite likely we're going to see further moves in that direction, and well, we'll see how they develop. So Merz offering no real solution to Germany's escalating problems, or indeed to Europe's escalating problems. The 19th sanctions package that the Europeans were working on has been kicked into the long grass, as I discussed in my video, I believe it was yesterday. Without the Americans imposing massive sanctions on the Russians, there is little point for the moment in the Europeans pressing forward with the 19th sanctions package. But bear in mind that we're going to have a G7 meeting before long, and it is likely that there will be further sanctions at the G7 level. It looks like they're going to target mostly Russia's banks and specifically its interbank messaging system. But as I've already discussed in previous programs, the Chinese and the Russians especially are already working around that, and the Turks, who now seem to be having no difficulty processing Mir cards, Russian Mir cards, appear to have made their own decisions here, and they seem to have found a way around there also. Meanwhile, there continue to be claims about France. The French seem to be in a state of significant political crisis. The new French Prime Minister, Monsieur Le Cornu, long-term political ally of President Macron, appears to have essentially abandoned the previous Prime Minister, Monsieur Bayrou's attempts to balance the budget. He is now actively courting the French Socialist Party and appears to be trying to cobble together some kind of parliamentary alliance within the French National Assembly with the Socialists. I am not sure, by the way, whether that would have a majority. I suspect the Socialists will go along with this. They are a party in decline. On the one hand, they cannot risk supporting the kind of austerity budget that Monsieur Bayrou was proposing, because if they did, the elderly people who continue to support the Socialists would be very unhappy, and the Socialists would see their support collapse, and it's already very reduced, come the next legislative elections. But it is likely that the Socialists are going to lose ground anyway in the next elections. There are reports that Socialist candidates, Socialist mayors, I should say, correct that, in various French cities, including Paris, are now facing challenges from what the French media refers to as the far left, meaning Jean-Luc Mélenchon's group. And, well, the one thing presumably the Socialists in France don't therefore want is new regional elections, which could wipe them out. But of course, at the same time, they can't risk antagonizing whatever remaining residual support in France they still have. So, as Alex Christoforou and I predicted long ago, after the last French regional elections, legislative elections last year, we're starting to see a kind of parliamentary alliance develop between Macron's centrist grouping in the French National Assembly and the socialists. The socialists are drifting away from Mélenchon. In fact, to all intents and purposes, they have burnt their bridges with him. But this is an alliance of stagnation. It cannot move forward with any of the major reforms and structural changes, whether those be from a left-wing perspective, a left-wing program, or the kind of neoliberal perspective that Macron perhaps would favour, pro-business perspective, or perhaps the more corporatist, dirigist approach that appears to be favoured by Marine Le Pen and the National Rally. This is a coalition of stagnation, keeping things as they are, not engaging in any experiments, not trying anything important, holding out for the next year that Macron is still president, buying Macron time so that he can cobble together his coalition of the willing and try and move forward with his program to support Ukraine, whilst at the same time perhaps giving Macron an opportunity to prepare the way for Le Cornu to position himself as the candidate of the centre who Macron will back and who the political establishment in France will back in the next presidential election. I spoke about how in Britain we no longer have government, we have administration. Starmer doesn't govern Britain. His cabinet merely administers. We are in exactly the same situation, or so it seems to me, in France. This at a time when the economic problems in Europe, in Britain, in France, the social pressures are mounting. This is what happens in countries in crisis. It is what the Greeks call stasis, a situation where no movement is possible. And, well, if you are familiar with Greek political theory, you will know, people like Aristotle, for example, you will know that stasis is the worst situation that a state can find itself in before things start to go seriously, perhaps even catastrophically wrong. So in the meantime, as we see, the Russians push forward in Ukraine. There is a military crisis there. And of course, the Middle East situation remains as critical as always. Well, this is all I can say today. As I said, this has had to be a shortened program. The situation in Gaza continues to go from bad to worse, but I will touch on that in my next program. Remains again for me to say that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day. Next program from Chicago.